Okay, thank you, Jan. We have 20 minutes left, and I have been asked to try relate the talks to some more general themes. Do you still want me to do that? Please. Yeah, I think people are tired, and maybe we should all stand up and make some kind of exercises or something. But very briefly. I have to say I didn't know about Sutzkever until a couple of days ago. I've written on Jean-Marie, another Holocaust survivor. I'm a philosopher by training, so I come from a quite different perspective. And what I would like to do is then to try connect some of the points from the papers as best as I can to some of the more general discussions in Holocaust studies and genocide studies and in discussions of responses to mass atrocities more generally. And so it deals with the subtitles of the conference and to make the connection between the concrete and the more general, or the local and the more general. And this Jean-Marie, he also said himself, we should always begin in the local, in the concrete event, in experience, but never get lost in it. Always also move a bit up and see around. And that's what I try to do. So first, I really like, Christoph, the way you try kind of locate or situate the writing of poetry in friendship even, and in the socio-cultural context. And with your focus on bridges, I guess that some bridges can only be built when there are people who reach out on both sides. I think that's part of what I took away from your talk. I think that the talks raises some general questions about the power of poetry. And we have heard in the talks and in the reading Sutzkever a lot about this power. And we have also heard about Adorno disclaiming the possibility even of poetry. And I just want to read a little short reflection on the power of poetry from these reflections of Jean-Marie. And it's about the experience that poetry doesn't work, it doesn't move him. And I want then to at least raise the question, why? What's the difference between Marie and Sutzkever? So this is in the essay on Auschwitz, on being in Auschwitz. And it stands in contrast, I think maybe in conscious contrast, to the episode narrated by Primo Levi, the well-known episode where Primo Levi and a friend remembers Dante's a stanza from Dante and are uplifted by that. So, Marie writes, and he begins with this quote from Hölderlin. The wall stands speechless and cold. The flags clank in the wind. I muttered to myself in mechanical association. Then I repeated the stanza somewhat louder, listened to the words, tried to track the rhythm, and expected that the emotional and mental response that for years this Hölderlin poem had awakened in me would emerge. But nothing happened. The poem could no longer transcend reality. There it was. What's going on? Is this because he reads a poem exactly written in a kind of poetry that Adorno disclaims? This is the kind of poetry, Hölderlin, that no longer works? Or does it speak to a difference between the poetic imagination of Sutzkever and Jean-Marie? Or does it speak to the difference between ghetto poetry and camp poetry? The difference between the total reality of Auschwitz and the reality of the ghetto. Maybe there's a difference in the degree to which agency is still possible in the life of Sutzkever and not really in the life of Marie. And maybe that is a context worth considering when we talk about the power of the poetic word. So that was the first. Geist und Gräuel, poetry and genocide. Second, I think, and really, really interesting comparison of literary form could be undertaken, because here we have lots of discussion about poetry, and I would also like to hear you. What is poetry? I'm not sure what is poetry. I only read Aristotle once upon a time about the difference between writing history and poetry, but what I know about is Jean-Marie and his reflections on the essay, and the essay for Amari was a fantastic form with which to reflect on Auschwitz and its realities. And Adorno, again, actually speaks about the form of the essay, that the essay helps us thinking about the kind of the other side of our concepts. What is on the other side? What we don't normally recognize in the categories and concepts that we use. And this, to Adorno, was the very task of thinking after Auschwitz. He says something like, the thinking that does not explore the other side of the concept is like the music with which the SS drowned the screams of the victims. Bang! And so what Amari does in his collections of essays is in each of the essays, spoken in German, written in German, by a man who changed his name from Hans Meyer to Jean-Amari. What he does in each of these essays is to take a concept, homesickness, ressentiment, being a Jew, and explore the difference between his experience of ressentiment as a survivor of the Holocaust and the understanding of ressentiment that his fellow Germans at the time after the Second World War and the Holocaust would harbor. So you think that I am this person, that I am a man of ressentiment. And when you think about that, and when you use the concept, my friend Germans, you have in the back of your mind maybe Nietzsche, maybe Scheler, maybe just this idea of someone who is not able to carry out the revenge that he actually desires. But let me share with you my thoughts about ressentiment, because it's a different kind. So in each of the essays, it's a different kind. So I think that Amari uses the essay, the form of the essay, the childishness, the openness of the essay to explore exactly what Adorno talked about. And I think that could be the beginning of a discussion about poetry and essayism and how the two forms as pieces of literature could maybe be compared, whatever, I don't know. Third point, healing, aesthetics of healing, restoration are concepts that are looked upon with great skepticism in the field of so-called transitional justice or reconciliation theory. I mean, if you look to countries like South Africa, Bosnia, also Germany after the Holocaust, there's a rush toward healing. One wants people to heal. Desmond Tutu, sitting in South Africa, presiding the Truth Reconciliation Commission, hope that people can forgive and heal, and we praise people who forgive and heal. Thus, in theory, in Holocaust testimony studies like Lawrence Langer, but also in psychology, in political theory, there's a hesitation towards using words like healing, harmony, restoration, and there's, one puts emphasis on confrontation, unraveling, and conflict. So there's a whole field called agonistic theories of reconciliation, agon, fighting, because the fight will continue. So, but is it different in poetry? Can we allow an aspiration to reconciliation or a notion, a dream of healing in poetry that we cannot allow in politics? So there's a general discussion about healing and confrontation that we could relate this whole discussion to. Finally, Adorno, poor old Adorno. I mean, then he wrote this sentence, poetry cannot be written, and he regretted it himself. And still, we keep on citing for that. And what did he write?
Word is powerful.
Yeah. And we need the sentence. But actually, what does he say? He says poetry. I think often when we discuss this sentence, poetry is not possible after Auschwitz. We talk about, we presuppose that he is talking about poetry about Auschwitz. But he says poetry cannot be written after Auschwitz. And this should lead our thoughts to something, then it's something different. It's about a certain kind of course, as you also suggest, of poetry that rings wrongly after Auschwitz. And I think one way to maybe better understand Adorno is to particularize his statements. In philosophers, we love to express general universal truths. So we love to make categorical sentences. Poetry cannot be written. But what I think is better to say is that a certain kind of poetical normative, a certain kind of poetry cannot be written. And then we can connect that to the other citation you mentioned at the end of Negative Dialectics, where Adorno talks about, is it even possible to live, as you say, after Auschwitz? And what I think he has in mind actually is something much more specific. It's not a question for all of us. I knew that he read Amarie's essay on torture. And in the essay, Amarie ends with the declaration that the survivor of torture of Auschwitz has lost trust in the world. And it's not really possible to live as a human being, forward directed and so on, without that trust. So for Amarie and for people like him, it's almost not possible to live. And you find this idea that we died and no one noticed, also in Charlotte Delbo. And I think maybe this is what Adorno means. Or he could think about Primo Levi and the dream that Primo Levi keeps talking about, that he is still in the lager. He wakes up in Italy, but he's actually still in the lager. He has this nightmare. So he keeps being, in some sense, in Auschwitz. So can he live? So I think if with your papers, I try to pull it into a more general issue discussion with Adorno, I would pull him the other way to make it kind of find the specifics behind the general statements. That's more than enough. I've tried to speak quickly, but not too quickly. We have 10 minutes left, and I hope that these thoughts were not just for you, but for everyone to step in. And you are, of course, also welcome to return to the specifics of the papers or Sutzkever or whatever. 10 minutes are left, so questions? Or from you, comments?
Don't we want to
respond? Yeah, but if you can respond, yeah. We can take
let's take
one of you. Christoph.
Many people wanted to kill poetry and didn't succeed. Never. So I remember the poem by Sutzkever about Selan, probably remember, about the jump out of the bridge, about the broken city again. Yes, and the poet standing, in full frustration and wanting to commit suicide. And Sutzkever is saying to Paul, I'm a river. I think it's something very much about how he understood poetry itself. It's when you use this metaphor of the bridge, yes, it's very, from different levels. Many things happened to disconnect us from the wholeness, from the neighbor, from the brother, from another bank of the river. Yeah, that's the truth about our life. But the truth is that there is longing in each of us to reconnect, to re-anchor. You couldn't avoid it. I don't know the city which was developed on one side of the river. There is something in us, asking us, calling us to cross, because we are not fully ourselves on one bank of the river. And that's a poetry which connects, which, it's in an old Ottoman language, the name of a bridge builder was a namer. A namer means a person who puts order or harmony into the chaos. And so it's like an architect of the space. And when I see this brilliant metaphor from Green Aquarium, that we are living on minefield. And you need the craft, the art of living is just to make a step which will not make you to die or to be, false or lost and so on. So all this attention craftsmanship, everything what makes you to make another step, in this field. So it's like a tune, like in a music air, that you can find the harmony. It gives you the map of crossing this minefield. That's why we can't live without poetry, because it's like losing this tune, yes, and very easily you could step on mine. Yeah, and so that's in very short. We can have all the discussion, But what I like in both Miłosz and Sutzkever is that they didn't allow themselves having such terrible experience, and I think this is something what made them, not to stay and say, the bridge is an illusion, because what we experienced during the Holocaust, during the war, that's saying that, we can't live together, or there is no way in that world to bridge. But in fact, they answer, and this is a paradox in my life. All my life, I work with bridge building, but my mentors are Holocaust survivors. It's Irena Vejsaite, it's from here, it's Avrom Sutzkever, it's Czesław Miłosz, and many people like that. Why is so? Why is this Holocaust survivors care about bridging? And why the lesson is not, let's stay separately and let's build a fortress? Why this is not an answer to that experience? I've never heard from them such answer to that.
Thank you. I will refrain from.
Just very shortly. Of course, what Marie says is this crisis of belief in culture and art, and Adorno is of course the obvious example of this position, which undermined that liberal cult of art, old liberal belief of culture's powers to stop in human aggression, and it's part of the reasons that are conditioning our present postmodern or postmodern thinking and reality. And I think we cannot return to that previous belief. But Sutzkever is an example of this critical rethinking and transformation of the language itself, and it's essential. And I think in that case he would perhaps agree with Adorno that some kind of language is impossible. And one more aspect to it is the understanding of a language as a very ambivalent medium, which is characteristic of Sutzkever himself. Words can lie, and words that lie are a deathly danger. This is the beginning of Green Aquarium, of this powerful statement of poetry. Words can definitely dangerous, and I think this ambivalence of language is also demonstrated, and of art is demonstrated in the situation of ghetto itself. Art is a heritage sought both by the Nazis and by the Papierbrigade, by the Jews that tried to rescue it. It's an object sought by both sides, and the fight is to which side this power of art belongs. So it's an ongoing fight.
Okay, so I'll just say what's shortly. I think we're talking about Western and Europe and Eastern European responses here, Jewish responses, and what sits. I don't think Adorno is so relevant in this context, frankly, because what sets Sutzkever and the other survivor writers apart here is that they actually they had a mission, a collective mission. It was not an individual. I mean, Jean-Marie and many others, they were struggling with this on a much more individual level. And but here you really had a context for these writings, and you had a readership. It's interesting. I want to refer to an article by another survivor writer, Avrom, who wrote a very interesting article about where she basically her argument is that many of these survivor writers committed suicide. Primo Levi, Amari, many others. And you didn't see that among these Yiddish. They didn't, I mean, it was a different context. And her argument is that one of the things she talks about herself, she was a survivor of Auschwitz, Avrom, is that she had a community that cared deeply about this, and also the Yiddish language as a life-confirming thing in itself that we see so strongly in Sutzkever. We see that as well in many of these other Yiddish survivor writers. So I think those things, it operates in a different context. And I actually do not think that Adorno and that whole discussion there is that relevant for this. That's just my own, maybe it's a little provocative what I'm saying, but that's what I could develop it more.
You refer to Adorno in your paper.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. But I refer to Adorno as the antithesis of this, because I think for Sutzkever, Yiddish poetry was the antidote to genocide, right? Yeah. It was like the life-giving vaccine that rescued you internally from all
wrong.
this.
That's plainly wrong.
Yeah,
that's not a vaccine.
Right. But that was that kind of that's
it's a hope. It's a nice aspiration, but it doesn't work.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I don't know if I'm agreeing with you. I'm not agreeing with you here. No. I think it might actually work.
But we better take that away.
Yeah, we'll take that and see it later. Yeah.
If there's, I guess we are all really waiting for coffee and break and everything. But if there's one burning question, okay. So there's a break. Am I right?
I think we have a break and coffee.